So, I mean, what we have included in this part, and Angela, again, please feel free to step in, is basically going through some of the. We're not going through methods any longer, but we're going through some thinking process about producing small area statistics, small area estimates. Okay, as part of that, you will see that a lot of the materials here is a bit repetitive in the sense that we will cover what we have already covered in previous sections, and so we'll just go through again. But we will try to put a framework around that so that you can try. To try and help you effectively in this process, because it can get quite complex when you are trying to produce these estimates. You have to make models, you have to make estimators, you have to make methods to try and put a framework around that. For parts of what I'm going to describe here, things have been already set in stone for you, because obviously you know what levels of geography you want to estimate for and so on. But nevertheless, I'm going to go through this, and maybe that will provide you a bit more food for thought in terms of what you're doing. So we know why small area estimation has become quite popular in terms of producing statistics, and it's basically because it's relevant to policy decisions, and also it's relevant to, you know, to one of the key functions of statistical offices and similar organizations is basically that they need to know, they want to know what basically is going on in terms of key dimensions that they are interested in, and then hopefully this will feed into policy considerations. And it's an area where effectively why we like it and we think that it's a very productive area is basically that it's an area with that has at least up to now has been connected with quite rapid methodological developments. So people who have worked in developing these methods also have a key interest in implementing the methods in real settings, and it's interesting how newer areas of statistical methodology are basically come into the small area estimation literature. And you know, one example, like one key example is, for example, machine learning methods. So that, you know, you are already considering this, and it's interesting to see these kind of areas coming into the production of small area statistics. So the other issue that has been clearly identified, especially in the last 10 years, is basically that if you look at the literature, when small area estimation methods started being developed, or the key papers that we described in previous sections, you'll see that they always talk about some kind of mean or proportion, or some kind of total, and you see that now people are more and more interested in more complex statistics. So, with a key example being some kind of poverty indicators, but there are other kind of indices that people might, or indicators that people might be interested in. And so that creates a quite good framework for having good cooperation between methodologists and practitioners, okay? And so that's partially what we do here. And you are possibly methodologists, but you are working within the setting of an official statistics institution, where kind of methodologies, but working in an academic setting, and basically having this kind of connection and this kind of discussions is really, really important, because as we have tried to make clear throughout this training, is that it's important to try and implement the methods in the best possible way. What happens sometimes is that the framework, though, for implementing the methods is not always clear. And basically, in some cases, we have come across examples where we have ad hoc use of methods and applications. Basically, someone comes and says, "Oh, I want to have poverty estimates of unemployment. Can you do something about it?" Or I want to have poverty estimates of income. Can you do something about it? Right? So that in some cases, there seems to be ad hoc implementation of methods, rather than thinking that this can be formulated into a common framework of producing the small area statistics. And that's becoming more and more the case, because the frequency by which these statistics are produced increases, and also these days some small area statistics, a number of small area statistics are also having status as national statistics. So it has to be governed by a proper proper implementation of methods and quality criteria and so on. So what we are trying to do here is basically to outline some. That's the aim of this session, is to outline some steps for producing small area statistics. We're going to use the what we call a principle of parsimony in small area estimation, right? So you don't have our simplistic way of thinking about these operations is. When it comes to implementing the methods in official statistics framework and producing statistics that are potentially accredited as national statistics, then you have to go by a principle of parsimony. So you don't have to use methods that are very, very complex for the sake of using complex methods, right? So if you can, for example, use simpler estimators that are well known, that have certain properties that we like design consistency and design biasness and so on, then do so. Right, so that's what I call by the principle of parsimony. Parsimony stands for simplicity, effectively. And of course, this is really a vast topic, and that came up in some of the communications we had prior to the training. It's a really vast literature. So, you can use various models, various specifications, various frameworks, and so on. You can use hierarchical-based methods. You can use frequentist methods. So it's inevitably, we're not going to cover all aspects of small area estimation as part of this session here. So we're going to describe some framework, and then we're going to give some examples as to how this framework can be implemented by using a case study. And so just illustrate a step-by-step process in practice. And the materials that we're using here are based on a paper that Angela and I and co-authors wrote, and Angela had a really key part in writing this paper and presenting that paper at the Royal Statistical Society. So so we had really quite lengthy discussions about that. And it is only one framework. I mean, people might come up with various different frameworks and various different ways of doing things. It's just one way of articulating, one way of articulating the processes that can be used for implementing small area methods. The other thing I want to say is that part of the session also will be based on a very nice website that the United Nations team have prepared. So I'll try to find this here. You will see that that link that will take you to the link into the United Nations page. I hope that you can view that, and then you can see on the left-hand side you can see the various tabs where you can go and talk about producing small area estimates, and then you will see that there is a framework here talking about user needs, talking about data availability. It follows a bit what is in the paper that Angela and I wrote with co-authors, but it goes a bit more and expands on that in various directions. Okay, so I would encourage you to use the link in the United Nations link, to go and explore the framework that has been set, and that probably will be a good thing to do in terms of also relating it to the operations that you have within DANE. So here is a bit of a framework that we have put here. So as I said, this is only one possible way of thinking about these things. It's not the only way to think about the problem. And we have split that framework into kind of 4 key stages that are presented there in this kind of purple colored shapes that we have. So namely, to name this is basically specification is one step. The analysis is the second step, and in the analysis you may have to adapt your strategy depending on what happens with your analysis. And then once you have a set of estimates, then the next step is the evaluations of basically being able to evaluate your estimates, and then at that point it comes. There are various ways to try and do validation, evaluation of your estimates, and then deciding whether the set of estimates you have is satisfactory. And then, depending on the answer to that question, basically you may have to go and adapt your strategy. And the specification step is really an important one, I think, because in order to specify the problem, the 3 things that we have identified as key areas is basically it has to do with user needs. So who are the users of the estimates that you want to produce, and what are they trying to get out of these estimates? That's one thing. The second thing is what data you have available, right? I can't consider a small area problem or any estimation problem, as a matter of fact, without understanding the data sources that are available, the structure of the data sources that are available, the characteristics of the data sources that are available. And that really takes a lot of time to come to terms with the various alternative data sources, what they measure and how can they be used in order to estimate or go through a statistical estimation process. And then obviously what kind of small area methods are available in order to do what you want to do. Then the other two important aspects that I think really need quite a bit of discussion between users and between methodologies is basically defining the targets of estimation in geography. So what do you want to estimate, right? And at what level of geography or domain you want the estimates to be produced for, okay? And that's very important because that also relates to the kind of data that you have available and whether the data that you have available can support what you're trying to do and at the level of geography that you want to do the estimation for. And you know, and then also it will affect also the methods that you may be using as well. So because think of a situation where you don't have census data or population administrative data and so on, immediately you are starting basically your options start reduced in terms of what kind of methods and what kind of targets of estimation, target parameters you can estimate with those. So basically defining the parameters of interest, the population parameters of interest, defining the geography, and then selecting, basically identifying an initial set of methods that you can use is really important. And obviously, because methods have to be implemented, basically identifying also the software that is available, potentially available to use. Obviously, in places they may write their own code, but in some other places they may rely on existing routines that can be used in order to implement the methods. Okay, so basically that fits into the analysis, and then using the identified methods, then you can get preliminary estimates, possibly multiple set of estimates that you can use, you can output. And then once you have the preliminary estimates, then you can evaluate these estimates. And then depending on the result of the evaluation, then you go to, if you're satisfied by the estimates, then obviously you can get your final estimates and get some uncertainty measures around this and then present them. Or if you are not, then obviously you have to go back and proposing a new specification, potentially using additional data sets, potentially using different methods, and then repeating this process. So basically that gives you an initial framework for you to think about the production of your statistics. Clearly, in the analysis steps and the evaluation steps, these are steps that we covered in this training session. Basically, in the analysis, Angela presented estimators, direct and model-assisted estimators. I presented estimators or predictors using area level models and unit level models, so that all of this are part of the analysis. And in terms of the adaptation stage, obviously, we presented, we assessed models and we adapted our strategy depending on what the model diagnostic showed us, and we had to consider transformations, for example, if we felt that some of the model assumptions do not hold. Okay, what we haven't quite discussed as part of this training is, for example, the targets of estimation in geography, because I assume that for DANE this is quite well defined, and unless there are other things that you may consider estimating which are not at the moment defined as part of the exercise. But I suspect that you know what you're trying to estimate, and you know that the geography that you're trying to estimate for, because a scheme of municipalities, for example, is a given geography, and that is what, say, the government or practitioners or policymakers are interested in, right? So, okay, that gives you a possible small area framework. So I'm going to go a bit more in detail into this framework. So as I said, the first thing is to define the targets of estimation and the target geography, and then is to determine the data requirements and the coverage. So basically, it is very tempting to get to target an unrealistically low geography, okay? And the fact that users are more and more increasingly interested in more complex parameters, then that will also affect the type of data you need to have access to. Okay, so how granular, how the granularity of your data sets that you need to have access to, and also it will affect the type of estimation method to use. Clearly, in your case, that's not a big problem because you have rich data sources, but if you come across other kinds of applications where basically the data sources are not that rich, or maybe you're in a setting where you don't have access to these data sources, then obviously you have to consider all these steps. And the other thing you need to consider is basically why do you want to produce a small area estimates, right? What is the purpose of producing them? One is to produce just estimates and put some uncertainty measure around those, or maybe the government may want to do something more with these estimates. So, for example, if someone is interested in some kind of evaluation and monitoring of some program, and they want to compare areas before and after some kind of implementation of an intervention, or perhaps if they want to allocate funds according to some estimates. So here we're not describing the latter. We're not really explicitly using methods in order to do fund allocation or evaluation and monitoring. See, here we just describe methods for producing estimates with an associated measure of uncertainty that will be presented as part of a report or as part of producing national statistics. So it's quite important to know, though, why this exercise takes place and what are the uses of these estimates. So let's look at an example we look at an example about the data requirements that you need. So as we said, remember that, and that's a topic that can cause quite a bit of confusion for people. Again, it's important to know what you want to estimate. So if you're interested in estimating something that is a linear statistic, then say averages, proportions, and things like that, then as we described, in addition to the design-based methods that we described in section 1 of the training, you can have access to area-level auxiliary information. If you use model-based methods, then access to area-level auxiliary information will be sufficient. So you don't need a lot of detailed information, really. On the other hand, if, as we described in the third section of this training, you're interested in also non-linear indicators, so it's poverty indicators, inequality indicators, then access to some population level data, macro data, is required by the most commonly used methods. Okay, so the methods that we described as part of the training, the ELL method and the EBP method and so on, these methods require, assume the existence of this microdata. Okay, so it's really important, therefore, to know what assumptions the different methods that are available are making, and what are the assumptions about the data requirements that the different methods are making. That's really important. And then regarding the target geography, it is important. It is really an important step also that determines the use of estimation methods. there are situations where the target geography is not clear. In your case, this is not the case, I think. And in most cases, I would say when you work with national statistical institutes, they have a very clear idea what is the level of geographical level that they want to produce estimates for. Okay. In some cases, we have come across discussions with practitioners where they are really insisting on going too low, which might be very tempting to go too low, but you have to be a bit realistic as to how far we can stretch the methods, right? So the methods will not always because you use a model, you will not always be able to produce the estimates at the very low level, right? And there is a bit of a tension also in the literature. So you come across papers, not so much in an official statistics context, but in other applications where people say, well, we produce estimates for grids of 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer, for example, right? So the model can be used to extrapolate or interpolate for whatever geography you want, but the question is this a good idea? And what kind of estimates, the quality of the estimates you produce, is that the estimates of good quality? So all of these tensions come into play, and you really need to be in command of what you're doing and the geographical levels that you're interested in producing estimates for. Questions of the kind that, whether you have sample data available in every domain are important. So starting by looking, for example, at the distribution of your sample size in the domains of interest or the geographical areas of interest is really important. So, for example, if you had sample data in every domain, then the question is, why don't you use to start with some direct estimator as a good starting point, because you have observations in every domain of interest. Again, in most real applications, this might not be the case, as is the case in DANE. But again, just starting by looking at how the sample data is allocated at different domains is really important, right? Simple descriptive analysis, as we do with every statistical analysis, right? Start by looking at your sample data and how they are distributed across the geographies of interest. Obviously, if you can use a direct estimator, then, or some of the estimators that Angela described, then obviously these have desirable theoretical properties. They're easy to implement. You can use the survey packets, the sampling packets, and so on to implement the methods, right? Now, if that's not possible, then if it's not possible either because you don't have samples, for example, you don't have sample in every geographical area, or because the sample sizes are not large enough to give you the desired precision or the coefficients of variation that you want to have, then it's likely to depend on models and assumptions, basically. And that's why small area estimation is one of these areas where the use of models, the cautious use of models, as I will describe a bit later, is accepted now by national statistical offices. Is something that, and rightly so, stats offices may feel a bit apprehensive about the use of models and assumptions when they produce national statistics. But for small area estimation, there seems to be some understanding that the careful use of models might be required. Okay. However, don't ignore basic estimators, right? Don't ignore direct estimators, because these are a really good starting point and a good guide for what happens next. So let's look at the case study, and we have looked a bit into this case study when we did we implemented the ABP method. So it's a case study from the state of Mexico. It's the one we used for the paper that we wrote with Angela. The target parameter, the target geography in this application were the municipalities, which is also a very low geography in terms of the country in Mexico. And what they are interested in Mexico is things that probably you are interested in, similar things here in Colombia, as is the case in other countries. You're interested in some kind of basic average or median equivalized income some deprivation indicators such as the at risk of income poverty or poverty gap, potentially some inequality measures as well. But let's forget about the inequality measures at this point and think about the kind of standard poverty indicators. The data that were available in the case of the application in the state of Mexico were survey microdata, which sounds like is the data that you have in your high-access survey, if I pronounce that correctly. We have there were also available census covariate microdata. Okay, and remember that for the ELL and the EBP methods, you really need to have variables or explanatory variables or auxiliary information in your survey data and in the census data that are referring to common covariates, right? And they're measured in some kind of in a common way, like they're measuring the same thing effectively. And looking at these data sets and looking at what people are interested in estimating, then it seems like the data availability is appropriate for estimating both linear and nonlinear indicators, because you have census microdata, you have survey microdata. Using these data sources, you can use some kind of poverty mapping methodology in order to estimate what you want to estimate. Now, with the census microdata, you need to exercise some caution, because the first issue is the timing of the survey data collection and whether that is close to the timing of the census collection. And we discussed that partially because as we move away from the census data collection, there are legitimate concerns that are raised whether the census data can still be used as a good explanatory set of explanatory variables for prediction purposes. And so that's why quite a bit of the literature at the moment is trying to move away from using the census data. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing is basically, as I said, the consistency of the definitions between the survey and the census data. Again, be very careful. Do a proper assessment of how things are measured, and then consider if there are any problems there. Regarding the timing, I suspect in your case, in the case of your application, that's why probably you bring in some additional information from administrative data sources to try and perhaps reduce reliance on the census. But we can discuss that tomorrow when we go through your presentation. So let's look at the basic things. As I said, good descriptive analysis. As I said, in the state of Mexico, which is presented here in this map, that's the state of Mexico. You will see that the boundaries that are defined here, apologies here, the boundaries are defined in terms of these are municipalities, okay? And you have 58 municipalities in sample and 67 are out of sample. So where you see in this plot the sort of colored areas in different shades of blue, that tells you that this corresponding municipality has sample data present in the survey dataset. So in the ENIC, let me go back to the ENIC survey. That's how it's called, the survey. So where you see that there is a color, a blue color, then that means that the corresponding municipality has some sample observations present in the survey data, and the intensity of the color indicates that the higher the intensity, the darker the color of the area, then the higher the size of the sample data set in that municipality. So you see that this here is a Mexico City around here, and you see the color is a lot more intense and a lot darker here. So you see that around these municipalities you have quite a bit of presence of sample observations. But you see in this corner of the map, right, you have many municipalities that are out of sample. So out of sample municipalities are basically indicated by the white areas here. These are areas where you have no data at all, okay? So, but the point is that we need to fill in all the gaps here somehow. What the policymakers and practitioners and other people are expecting is basically to be able to have an estimate for each one of these areas, an estimate of whatever the targeted parameter is, for example, the headcount ratio or the poverty gap. So where do you start from? Okay, so I think one way to think about that in some kind of logical sense is basically to start with estimators that can be obtained as a byproduct of existing estimation processes. So Dana has existing estimation processes. You estimate things like means and proportions and totals and so on. So you could use these kind of existing estimation processes in order to estimate things at a lower geographical level, if possible. And that's basically what we call by the principle of parsimony. These are the simplest possible estimators that you can use without using models, without using any fancy estimation methods, but by using good old standard survey estimation, basically, that has been implemented all over the world for many years. And this is a very good starting point, right? Because it will inform you about how well your direct estimates, for example, or potentially synthetic estimates are. So I'm not going to go through everything that Angela presented at the start of the training course, but we talked about the Hayek-Brewer estimator or the Horowitz-Thompson estimators, when we have no auxiliary information. That's simply just a weighted, say, when we estimate means, it's a weighted estimator where you use the survey weights to obtain estimates. You can have direct estimators that bring in some auxiliary information that you think is beneficial to have because it correlates with what we're trying to measure. And Angela presented, say, Greg estimators and then calibration estimators. You can have very simple estimators called synthetic estimators, either with no auxiliary information. For example, you may say, if I go back to my plot here, you may say that for those areas where you have no observations at all, you may say that an estimate for that area may be gathered by aggregating data from a bigger area, right? So that's a very simple synthetic estimator where you use the data, the estimate at some higher geographical level to impute the estimate for some lower geographical level where you have no observations, right? And you can have a synthetic estimator that is based on some kind of model-assisted model, and this is an estimator that we described in parts of the training, where you see that you use a working model, say a regression model, fit it to your survey data. You have auxiliary information that is known at the population level in the area. You combine that with the estimated model parameters under your model, and that will give you a synthetic estimator. Okay, so and obviously you can use composite estimators, and Angela described the issues with the composite estimators in terms of estimating the bias and estimating the mean squared error and so on. So, but this is an initial triplet of estimates that you can use. You can use direct estimates, you can use direct estimates with auxiliary information such as Greg estimators, and also you can use synthetic estimators. And then see what this set of initial estimates tell you about your problem. Okay, that's a starting point. So I think going back to your exercise, going through Angela's section 1 and computer lab 1 is a really good starting point, right? Because it will help you then to set the scene for what happens next. Okay, so just to give you an idea, here are some initial estimates of average income. So we just estimated average income in the case of the data from Mexico. And effectively, what you can see here is that you get some point estimates, and clearly the point estimates are available only for the areas here because we use a direct estimator, like a Horowitz-Thompson estimator. The direct estimates are only available for the areas where we have sample data. Okay, for the areas where we don't have sample data, we don't have estimates because we cannot calculate direct estimates. We have no sample data, so we have to do something else. Either we have to use make some synthetic assumption, or we have to use a model. On the right-hand side here, you get some estimated coefficients of variation. Okay, and you see that some areas have very small, low coefficients of variations, around 10% or 15% and so on. But there are some areas that have very high coefficients of variation, those that are represented here by the orange color and the red color and the yellow color potentially. So, and these are high coefficients of variation because the sample sizes probably are quite small in these geographical areas. Now, why is this important? Why we think this is important to be replicated in your case is because at least you can get a sense of how close or how far you are from where you want to be, right? So I assume that if you implement that with your data, obviously for 40% or maybe 50% of the municipalities, I don't quite remember what Jose said, is out of sample, you will have no estimates, no direct estimates at least, but at least can we see what happens with those estimates that are for in-sample areas, right? What are the coefficients, the estimated coefficients of variation? Are they big, are they small, and so on? So that's a starting point, right? And I'm sure you have already done that because you have mentioned coefficients of variation for direct estimates. But again, it's something we can discuss tomorrow. Okay. So let me stop here before I go into the analysis and adaptation and ask you if you have any questions. So I'm looking at the audience here, and do you have any kind of questions at this stage? Does it make sense? Does it help you? Jose, I see your microphone is on.
Thank you, Nikos. Yeah. I have two questions, but from the last sessions, I'm not sure when to ask them, but I'm gonna take the opportunity. Okay.
Yeah, tell me now, and I will tell you if I'm going to cover them a bit later, and I will tell you and answer the questions a bit later. But tell me what the questions are. It's important to interact with you. Yeah, please.
Okay. The last session we saw design-based and model-based evaluation, but I have the doubt or the question about how to fit these stages of evaluation in the overall framework, because in each of the indicators we discuss is estimators. We discuss we see you talk us you say how to assess and evaluate them, but in this process of design-based and model-based evaluation, also we see that there is another stage of assessment of performance. So I get the how to it seems to me like design-based and model-based evaluation are like the overall framework to evaluate the complete set of estimators. And okay. And the other question was about if you can tell me about something about the difference of this approach when we are interested in prediction and when we are interested in the betas or in the impact of each one of the variables. This is a more theoretical or general question, but I know you mentioned that we are interested in prediction. We are not gonna say that much. We're not gonna interpret the betas.
Yeah, that's
so
fine.
This was my two questions.
So thank you, Jose. So we're not interpreting betas at all here, right? Because we are also interested in prediction. So with the ELL method, with the EBP method, with all of these methods, you are also interested in prediction, right? So the frameworks that we have described are not aiming at having some kind of substantive analytical, substantive interpretation of the betas or of the model, right? Obviously, when you build your model, in the background, you may have some kind of potential variables that are going to be predictive of what you're trying to predict. Now, this is a bit more of a philosophical thing here. You can let an algorithm basically decide what's the best combination of the variables of interest, and then that gives you the best prediction according to some criterion. So that's fine. I don't have any problems with that, right? But up to now, we haven't talked at all about interpretations of the model. We are also interested in prediction, right? And you can predict you can estimate, but we talk about prediction because obviously you use a model-based framework using the EBP and ELL methods, right? And the difference from using a kind of alternative modeling tool like a logistic model or a tree-based model and so on is basically that the method or the algorithm that you're using is different, but the end output is exactly the same, in the sense that all methods are effectively trying to estimate a parameter of interest at the level of the small area. Okay, so that's the first point. The second point is you talk about the model-based, design-based evaluation framework, and let's say both evaluation frameworks are trying to do the same thing, but in slightly different ways. So let's focus more on the design-based evaluation framework, because I think in the context of an official statistics setting, I think the design-based evaluation framework is a bit more relevant. So remember what Angela did in Computer Lab 1. In Computer Lab 1, she used some kind of sample data, and bootstrapping the sample data created a synthetic population data set, right? In your case, you may have already a synthetic population data set because you may have some kind of census data and so on. So you can treat that as your population, okay? And what you do from there is basically by selecting samples repeatedly, for each of the samples you select, you can implement whatever method you want, right? You can use an EBP, you can use an ELL, you can use a machine learning, you can use a tree classifier, you can use a logistic model, you can use whatever method you are interested in with the sample data that has been selected from the population according to some sampling design, okay? And with each of the samples, you don't only do point estimation, but you can also do estimation of the uncertainty, like the mean squared error, the variance, whatever the measure of uncertainty is. So you are right, like the design-based evaluation framework and the model-based evaluation framework provides a generic framework that you can use in order to assess how well both your point estimates and your estimates of the uncertainty, the estimators of your uncertainty, because remember, that you're not only using point estimates, you are also using estimators of the mean squared error, say. How well these are, what are the properties of these, the empirical properties of these estimators, right? Do they provide confidence intervals with appropriate width? Do they provide confidence intervals with appropriate coverage, for example, right? Can we assess that? Do we have under coverage or over coverage in the confidence intervals that we are creating? So all of these things can be done within the design-based evaluation framework. So with one sample, what you can do is you can get point estimates, and you can get some estimates of the mean squared error under some method. But if you wanted to understand how well or how not so well your point and mean squared error estimates are doing, then obviously you can put that into a more generic framework, such as the design-based evaluation framework, okay? That is not part of a production of national statistics necessarily, but is something that you may wish to consider if you want to compare a number of methods at the same time, right? So you say, I'm selecting a sample from my hypothetical population, and then I'm comparing a number of methods using the same sample. And then I'm selecting another sample, and I implement exactly the same methods with the second sample. And then over repeated replications from the population, you can start constructing some comparisons about the point estimates that have been produced by using the different different estimators, different methods, different models, and so on. Okay, Jose, does this answer your question?
Yes, it is. It answered it. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to go a bit more in detail. We're going to cover that a bit more, but I think you really need to do it at some point, right? I mean, you know, I can describe it for a long time, but I think at some point, if you are interested in that, I think the materials that Angela gave you will help you to understand a bit better when it happens in practice. What are the advantages of of using a design-based or a model-based evaluation framework? Paula, did you have a question, or was it my impression? Because I saw another microphone going on, but maybe I misunderstood. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to continue now, and I'm going to talk about a bit the analysis and adaptation stages, and here we're going to start introducing the use of models in small area. As we said, maybe the initial triplet or maybe some direct estimates that you output may not offer the required precision. Even if they do, you may wish to explore cautiously some models to see if you can improve a bit further what you're trying to do, the precision of the estimates. But in any case, the important thing is that basically producing direct estimates, and it will always be a good thing, because you want somehow to compare model-based estimates against direct estimates or other survey estimates that you can produce with your data. So, as I said, small area estimation is an area where models are cautiously accepted, and the use of models is cautiously accepted. And so what we want to focus is on methods for estimating general sets of parameters, not just means or proportions, but maybe a general set of parameters. Okay, and in the section that in sections 2 and 3, because now we move to the use of model-based methods, we described in section 3, we described methods based on unit level models with a continuous outcome. So the outcome that you're using is a continuous outcome, right? In the case of poverty mapping, is a monetary outcome. And we described methods like the World Bank approach. I'll call it the World Bank approach. Probably this is not appropriate here. It's the method that is based on the paper by Elbers et al. In 2003. And then we described in some detail the EBP approach, and then we described also differences between the ELL and the EBP approach. And there are other extensions based on the EBP method that we described in the previous section. The other option that you have is, as I said, is to use area level models. Okay. Now with area level models, we remember that estimating proportions, okay, possibly under an appropriate transformation, because remember that the proportion is between 0 and 1, is one way to do things. If you wanted to use area level models to directly estimate more complex indicators, say like an inequality index, like a tail index or a Gini coefficient, these models, we haven't covered it as part of this training. But as I said, there is literature out there that allows you to implement area level models with the purpose of estimating more complex indicators. The problem is that with area level models, that every time you define a new indicator, a new target parameter, then you have to fine tune your area level model for that particular parameter. In contrast, if you use unit level models, and if you have the appropriate access to the population data that are assumed by these models, by these methods, like the ELL and the EBP methods, then you just specify the model for one outcome, and then because we simulate synthetic population censuses under the model, we end up basically calculating a range of parameters as a result of this process. Okay, so it requires more access to data that are more difficult to get access to. But if you have access to the data, and if you're happy with the data sources and the quality of the data sources you have, then using unit level models will basically do the estimation all at once, right? So you don't have to worry about specifying another model and specifying another model each time that you have a new target parameter. Okay, so there are pros and cons, and depending on the situation, then you can decide whether to go for area level models or to go for unit level models. Going back to the point that Jose made, small area estimation is a prediction problem, right? And so I want to, in the methods that we presented, we used as a standard model the nested error regression model, the random effects model. So getting the fixed effect of the model, of the spec of the model well is very crucial, right? So I want to have a model that predicts well. So what I include as part of my auxiliary information is very, very important. So model selection is important. So the aim is to have a good fixed effect specification to reduce the unexplained between area variability. Okay, this is not always possible, and you may have unobserved heterogeneity present in your model, right? So in your data. And that's basically where you need to start thinking, do I want to include random effects in my model or not? Right? Remember, the random effect is that term in your model, the U term, the UI term, that it's typical to be included in a small area model. I'm not sure you include terms like that in the methods you currently consider. But if you have significant unexplained between area variability, then including the random effect is important. If your fixed effects part of the model, or if your whatever algorithm you're using explains a lot of that between area variability, then you may not have to include a random effect. However, it is important to consider this, whether a random effect is required or whether a random effect is not required. And in the literature, there are methods that allow you to test for the inclusion of a random effect for under specific models, right? And remember that this is important when we discuss the differences between the ELL and the ABP method. Remember that the ELL does not condition on the sample data, the ABP conditions on the sample data, and if you see the form of the predictor that you use, one has the estimated predictor using your sample data, that's the ABP, whereas the ELL does not include that as part of the prediction. Okay. Jose, did you have a question, or I had someone, maybe the microphone was on, but if you have questions, please. Yeah,
no,
Santiago.
Yeah,
Santiago.
thank you. So can we, when we talk about fixed effect, can we use, for example, department fixed effects? So here in Colombia, we have some municipalities, and also we have the departments that are kind of states, if you want. So can we use these departments as fixed effect to capture information from those municipalities that we don't have information? For example, these territorios nacionales that we talked a few days ago, we don't have information for some specific municipalities, but in average, we have information for the department. So I don't know, maybe in Cundinamarca, we don't have information specific for Soacha or for Gualvas. Yes. That's a municipality here in Colombia. But for Cundinamarca, we have information. So we use this fixed effect of this department just to capture the average effects, or the average the average effect of this department, to give information to those municipalities that we don't have information.
Absolutely. Santiago, you raise a very important point, because and stay on the microphone, because I may have to ask you something. So yes, you're absolutely right. I suspect that what you're saying is that for territorios nacionales, if I pronounce that correctly, you don't have observations from municipalities, right? So for these municipalities, you're going to end up basically doing something like a synthetic estimator, right? Now, what you're saying, though, is that you have information that may be coming from the departments, where these municipalities belong. And you say, well, in addition to some auxiliary information from those areas, okay, I may include also some fixed effects to try and capture something that may reduce the between municipality variability. So including these random effects might be a good idea, actually, right? It may help you. I don't know if it helps you in the particular example, but yes, it's a good idea, I think, right?
Okay.
If I understand exactly the structure of the data, but we can have another discussion tomorrow about this, because I think in your specification in the presentation, I've seen that you have some fixed effects for some departments or so. So I think that's a good idea because it may help you with refining a bit more your predictor for these municipalities. Okay?
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, great. But again, think about it, because the random effect is a really important part, at least in the models that we have presented here, right? It may be that you may use a machine learning algorithm. We haven't talked about machine learning algorithm, but because the machine learning algorithm is kind of predicting very well because of the way it fits to the data. It may be be predicting very well. I'm not saying that it cannot happen. It's highly likely that it will happen. But when you use the methods that are standard in the poverty mapping and poverty estimation, such as the ELL and the ABP, then considering the inclusion of random effects is very important. Considering having a good specification of the fixed effects model is really important, okay? So think about those things if you are planning to use the methods that we presented here as a comparison method, comparative method to what you are already doing, okay? So in terms of when you use the model, I think it's very important to run diagnostics, and because the models depend on normality assumptions, the ABP, for example, depends on normality assumptions, it's really important to run diagnostics, and we describe sets of diagnostics. That's the kind of in the analysis part, basically you're willing to try and do some model validation. I gave some examples on Monday. If the model assumptions are not met, as I said, it's quite standard to use some kind of transformations, which is a parsimonious approach, because you keep still within the same framework of mixed models and so on, but you consider transformations. And maybe if the use of transformations does not help, then you can try and use some methods based on more flexible distributions. Again, we described some literature that is using a skew normal distribution. There is literature that uses the generalized beta distribution of the second kind. And obviously, at that point, you may say, I may try some other algorithmic method or statistical learning method that it may help me to predict more accurately what I want to predict, okay? So, but again, you start with the principle of parsimony, right? You start with simpler models, build them, see what they give you, and then move on to more complex or methods for doing your predictions. So we described different ways of using transformations. I'm not going to go into detail here because we already covered that. You can use a standard logarithmic transformation. You can use a logarithmic transformation with a fixed, with an optimal shift parameter, or you can use a data-driven transformation, scale transformation. If you want to use standard software, like because of the scaling, you can still use standard software. Okay, and here are two examples of how you can adapt your model to use a logarithmic transformation of your y, of your outcome, and then adding here a shift parameter s, such that the shift that you select makes the skewness of the residuals close to 0, for example. Okay, so you see here for the data in the state of Mexico, getting a value close to, say, I don't know, 300 makes the skewness of the residuals close to 0. That's one way of doing it. The other way of doing it is to use some kind of more data-driven approach to selecting the transformation parameter. Here is the example that I gave you also on Monday, where you use a grid of potential transformation values, and then basically you obtain the lambda parameter for the power transformation by deciding what is the best fitting model within this grid. Okay, by using the different values of the grid, fitting the model and finding the lambda value that maximizes the log likelihood. Okay, or some other measure that you may define. So there are different ways of doing that. Okay, so this is basically adapting your model if your model assumptions do not hold. The use of transformations, as I said, is in the applications that you're considering. If you use income, expenditure, consumption type data, there will be the standard way to try and fit the models. Okay, and here is nothing more than just showing you the impact of not using a transformation, using a fixed log transformation, a log shift transformation, and a box-Cox transformation, and how that impacts on some measures of model prediction as you consider the different types of transformation. Okay, the other thing I wanted to say is that here are the results, some results where we produced estimates of two indicators. One is the poverty gap. The poverty gap is given by the second row here, and the top row gives you the estimates of the Gini coefficient, right? And we used three types of transformations: is a fixed log transformation, a log shift, and a box-Cox transformation, right? And one of the things that we noticed is that depending on what you're trying to estimate, the choice of transformation possibly might be important, right? So, for example, for the Gini coefficient here, right, this is quite a complex measure to calculate, to predict for small areas. You see that using a log transformation will give you quite different results from using a log shift and a box-Cox transformation. The log shift and the box-Cox transformation, the estimates are a bit closer, but you see the log estimates are quite different, right? Whereas when you are interested in estimating something like a poverty gap, then the choice of transformation may not have such a big impact, right? So again, knowing and understanding what are the target parameters of interest, that again starts in the framework. It starts at the very top of the framework, where you have well-defined indicators, parameters of interest. I think that's an important consideration when it comes to the choice of transformation as well. Now let me go to the evaluation stage, and there are a few things that are important here. One is we cannot really escape that, right? We really need estimates for the uncertainty, some measure of uncertainty. When we use models, we are normally interested in a measure of the mean squared error. And I noticed that in your presentation there is probably an open topic. Maybe you can help me. Maybe you have made progress on that, and we can discuss again tomorrow. But you say that I think I read, if I'm correct, that an open topic is how to measure the uncertainty of your estimates, right? And that's really, really important. So you may be able to use a very complex or quite a nice algorithmic way of doing things and predicting things, but that's not the end of the story. For whatever estimates you produced under whatever method, you need to be able to say something about the uncertainty of these estimates. So this is really important. The second thing that I have put here is in terms of method evaluation, and that goes back to the question that Jose had about model and design-based evaluations. You don't have to use this framework all the time, but if, as you are probably at the stage you are now, you're considering a number of potential methods, then having an evaluation framework such as a design-based evaluation framework might be a good idea. And what Angela and I can do as we move forward is perhaps we can open this discussion with you or with a group of you, depending on who is working on that, as to how such a design-based evaluation framework can be defined, and then what you can do with that in terms of assessment of the various methods. Okay. So the mean squared error estimation is really, really important. A lot of the small area literature really focuses on the estimation of the mean squared error. It is important because we are producing official statistics, right? It is increasingly complex because of the increasing complexity of the parameters. When we talk about linear parameters, remember when we define the small area means as part of the area level models or as part of the unit level models, we had analytic estimators such as the Prasad-Rao estimator that is based on a Taylor approximation, Taylor series linearization. But when we go to more complex parameters, then we rely a lot on the use of computer-intensive methods, okay? And the methods that we saw quite heavily in the previous sessions is relying on bootstrap methods, and in particular parametric bootstrap methods under the model, okay? So keep that in mind. Mean squared error estimation is really important. And the model-based versus design-based evaluation, we have already described that. A very important step, and includes evaluation both of point and mean squared error estimates, right? So you don't get only the proportion of poor households or poor people in a municipality, you get also the uncertainty around this estimate. And both these sets of estimates have properties, and you can use a model-based or a design-based evaluation framework to study these properties empirically. I mean, people have studied the properties of methods also in an asymptotic framework, but as the methods become more and more complex, then we rely also on empirical methods in order to assess the empirical properties with finite samples, the empirical properties, okay? So again, remember that model-based methods will use some synthetic population data that are generated under a model, and then you do some sensitivity analysis to model assumptions. The design-based framework, you use a fixed data set, whether that's a population data set or something else. The data generation is not model dependent, so the fixed data that you have, the population data that you use, does not depend on a model, and you use repeated samples from that fixed population according to some sampling strategy. And with each of the samples that you select over repetitions, you implement whatever methods you want to consider in the comparisons, right? It can be, say, if you use poverty mapping, it can be the ELL method, it can be the EBP method, it can be some of the classification tree methods, the logistic models that you're using, and so on. So you can try and incorporate a number of modeling tools and estimators that you may wish to consider. Okay. In terms of computing and software, right? A lot of the code for small area estimation is written in NAR. It's open source, easy to access code, and easy to modify and extend. A lot of this training was provided using the EMDI package. So you have labs, you have documentation on the EMDI package that you can use to implement both area level models, unit level models, and some direct estimators. You also have in Computer Lab 1 libraries such as the survey library that you can use in order to estimate, to implement some of the estimators in session 1. There is another package, the SAE package. So this is also a very powerful package, and it includes some additional models that may have a temporal component, a special temporal component. But you have other packages that are also available. So if I click again this link, this will take me to the United Nations web page. Again, there is a section of software packages. And you can see here that you have packages in NAR, in Stata, in SAS, in Python, and so on. R will have most of things, but there will be other computer software that you can use as well. And down here you have a list of packages. So you have the Sae packets can do both unit level and area level models. You have the EMDI packets that can do both area level and unit level models, and descriptions about the vignettes that you have. So basically, if I click on the EMDI packets and let me just click here. Hopefully that will take you to the paper that was written by colleagues in 2019, and so you can read through this vignette effectively to see what exactly the EMDI package is doing, right? So let me go back. So you can study a bit this page. I don't know if you're familiar with this resource that the UN data for now, the UN Statistics Wiki, they have produced, but it's really a good resource. You can see here there are things in Python, and there are things in SAS if for people who are using SAS in state as well, right? So and you have all the references here that are relevant to this section. There are other things you can do if you want to see some of the functions and go into detail. There was work that colleagues and I did a long time ago, around 2010, where a big part of a European Union project was to develop software for methods. And so you can visit if you click here. Hopefully that will open. So you see here you have it was a project on small area methods for poverty and living condition estimates that was funded by the European Commission. And here you can see you have all the deliverables, so you can go through this and you can see all the software, for example, for the different deliverables. Of course, since then a lot of things have been developed because I think that this is about 2010, so we are now 10-12 years later, so the literature has moved on, but again this is a resource that is available to you. Okay, in terms of communication of the small area estimates, again, I suspect that when you come to write your report about poverty mapping, it is important to find a way to communicate this. And it depends really who is your target audience, right? Is your target audience a group of methodologists within DANE? Is it the target audience perhaps a ministry in Colombia or some other group of policymakers? Identifying the best form of communication really depends on the audience, right? And it depends because, you know, if you want to talk to methodologists, so for example, you know, when you discuss with Angela and myself, you may want to include a lot more information about the methods because we will ask you about it, right? We have an interest in that. We want to see how you use the methods. Can you do something to improve some of the use of methods? We want to know what is going on. Whereas when you talk to another target audience, clearly they may not be so interested in the detail, the exact detail of the methodology, but they will be more interested in the results. Okay, so but generally speaking, the information that you need to communicate has to include something around the methodology, okay, the input data, the types of models you use, the assumptions you use, what kind of validation have you done, model selection and validation. Quality measures is really important. As I said, you can't really have estimates without having quality measures and comparability with other estimators. Give examples on how to interpret the results is important. Visualization, including possibly maps and graphical tools to communicate your results, is really something that helps a lot, especially non-technical audience to understand what you're doing. Regional disaggregation is important, and other domain disaggregation. So you may have a municipality disaggregation, but maybe you want also to consider other domain disaggregation, for example, poverty status by, say, key demographic characteristics, such as age and gender and other domains, other categories of interest. Okay. Again, the UN has created a really nice platform again, where it takes you through the communication of the small area methods and the results. Okay, so it gives you examples about visualization, it gives you examples about other domain disaggregation, exporting the estimation results, and so on. So, you know, it's quite nice to read through this resource, because it may give you ideas, if you have not already done, because it will give you ideas as to how to best communicate this. As part of the materials, I sent you an example of a World Bank poverty assessment report that was particular in Sri Lanka. It's a bit of an old report as well, but it gives you also a document that might help you to structure your report as well. And I'm sure you have examples in Dane as to how a report like that may look like. So the content of that report includes things like the introduction to the problem, again, describing the data and methods. The definition of the poverty line and the parameters is really important to explain clearly what is the poverty line that you are using if you do a poverty mapping exercise, what are the parameters that we are estimating, how you define the target parameters, right? Is it a poverty gap? Is it a poverty severity? Is it the incidence of poverty? How you define the geography, right? We talked about municipalities, we talked about departments, just giving a clear definition of these geographical levels. How many municipalities, how many departments, okay? Potentially sample sizes from your survey data for municipalities and departments, okay? Poverty estimates at the target geography with maps, conclusions and limitations, and what normally, in this example from the World Bank, the appendix includes detailed information. So the detailed information on the estimation, the sample, goodness of fit, model assessment criteria, different model specifications, robustness checks, potentially cross-validation, if you use cross-validation to verify your predictions. All of these things are included in an appendix because this information is relevant, but maybe the people who read the report may not be interested in all the detail, the technical detail. But the technical detail is important and has somehow to be included in an appendix. Okay. So the final slide, I think, or the penultimate slide, is some thoughts on topics of interest. As I said, there is a fast development of academic body of literature here. So keeping up with the literature is quite important. Identifying the parts of the literature that may be potential candidates to implement locally with your data is also very important. I would stress again the use of the principle of parsimony. Use complex methods when are necessary. That's fine, that's absolutely fine, but have a good justification as to why making a model more complex than is already is necessary. I would avoid using algorithmic methods just purely as a black box, right? There is increased availability of software tools, and that's great, but before I start using various software tools and various algorithmic tools, I would start with the basic things, the basic steps that I described, building it one step at a time, and then see how far I get and whether I have to consider more complex methods for what I want to do. Building small area estimation in a system of producing national statistics is very important, and that can have implications for the design of national surveys. For example, the way you select samples and how the sample falls into different areas, that can have a quite dramatic effect in the production of official statistics. And the final slide on my thoughts is that a lot of the methods that we use in poverty mapping rely on census microdata, and as I said, it is quite important to try and reduce in some way reliance on such data. Okay, they're very useful, but they're not updated very frequently, right? So what you're trying by trying to combine data from multiple, say, admin and survey sources is a step in that direction, an important one. The use of remote sensing data, geospatial data, if available, is also something because they are increasingly available, publicly available, and frequently updated. There are methods that have been proposed when in the presence of data linkage. So if you link data and there are issues with the uncertainty that is involved with the linkage of the data, then there are small area methods that have been proposed. I'm not suggesting that you do that now, but I want you to be aware that people have looked into that. And as I said, methods that attempt to reduce reliance on population, the use of population microdata, are also under exploration. Okay. The use of area level models is something that I would like you to keep firmly available as a potential method, because it has advantages in terms of data access, and area level models can naturally accommodate data sources such as remote data sources, right? You may not end up using area level models, but for those target parameters where area level models can be used, potentially you may wish to consider those as part of your estimation process and strategy. There are other issues, for example, that have to do with the estimation of the sampling variances, treating the sampling variances as known, and so on. So there are disadvantages to using area level models, but I think there are a set of powerful tools that you can use to as a potential competitor to unit level models. That's what I wanted to say. I think there are other things about integrating systems of data capture and statistical processing, but this is not for now. This is not for this training. I think this is all we had to say, formally what we had to say, what we wanted to cover as part of this training. You have our information here. You can email us at any point.